The facility sat like a tomb of glass and steel on the edge of the city, but inside, it breathed. They called it the Brain, a subterranean cathedral of servers that regulated everything from the timing of subway cars to the pressure in the water mains. To the elite engineers who arrived at 9 and left at 5, the Brain was a series of sleek monitors and status reports. To Rachel, it was a living, humming creature that only spoke to her at 3 a.m. The squeak of her rubber-soled shoes echoed against the polished linoleum as she pushed her yellow mop bucket past the high-security terminals. To the night guards, she was a ghost in a gray hoodie, a background utility no more significant than the air filtration system. They never noticed how she lingered near the humming racks of the Tier 4 sector, or how her eyes, quick and sharp beneath a messy fringe of dark hair, scanned the scrolling lines of the master diagnostic screens. In the dead of night, the city's heart had murmurs. Rachel would lean her mop against the wall and pull a stethoscope from her pocket, not for a heartbeat, but for the fans. She knew the exact pitch of a healthy processor. When she heard a discordant whine, she didn't call maintenance. She simply sat at a peripheral terminal, her fingers dancing over the keys with a grace that would have stunned the senior architects. She wasn't just cleaning the floors, she was pruning the forest. A bit of redundant logic here, a memory leak there, small, surgical strikes that kept the city's pulse steady while the world slept. She worked in the shadows of her own design, fixing the ghost code she had written years ago under a name that now lived only in classified legends. She preferred the invisibility. Here, behind a mop and a bucket, the trauma of the past couldn't find her. She didn't have to be the genius who broke the world, she could just be the woman who kept it clean. She would finish her adjustments, wipe down the terminal with a microfiber cloth to remove her prints, and disappear back into the service corridors before the first shift of arrogant young coders arrived to take credit for the system's miraculous stability. Rachel emptied her bucket into the utility sink, the smell of industrial lemon cleaner masking the ozone of the servers. She looked at her reflection in the stained mirror, the tired eyes, the strands of hair clinging to her damp forehead. She was safe as long as she stayed a shadow. But as she turned off the lights in the utility closet, a red light on the primary console flickered. It was a tremor she hadn't authorized. The city was about to wake up, and for the first time in years, the Brain was screaming. The red light on the primary console didn't just flicker, it pulsed like an open wound. Rachel dropped her cleaning rag, her pulse hammering against her ribs. This wasn't a minor glitch. It was a rhythmic, intentional bypass, a digital crowbar prying at the city's floodgate protocols. Forget the mop, if she didn't reroute the logic flow now, the transit system would lock up before the sun rose. She slipped into the high-security cradle of the restricted zone, her fingers flying across a haptic keyboard. She wasn't thinking about her badge or the rules, she was lost in the architecture of the code, a landscape she had built from nothing. The screen's glow reflected in her wide eyes as she began throwing up emergency baffles, her breath coming in shallow hitches. Step away from the console. The voice was cold, sharp, and dripping with an almost gleeful authority. Rachel froze, her fingers hovering over the Enter key. She didn't have to turn around to know it was Thomas K., the head of system security, a man who wore his ambition like a weapon and his tailored suit like armor. "Mr. Knight," Rachel said, her voice small, trying to mask the frantic genius in her eyes. "There's a cascade failure starting in the southern grid." "I was just..." "You were just trespassing," Thomas interrupted, walking into the light of the monitors. He looked at her worn hoodie and the bucket left near the doorway with a sneer of pure disgust. To him, she was a stain on his pristine floor. "I've watched you on the monitors, Nguyen. Creeping around the racks, touching equipment you aren't even qualified to describe. You're a janitor. You move trash, you don't touch the Brain." "The logic gate is failing," she insisted, her voice rising with desperate urgency. "If I don't patch this, the city goes dark." Thomas stepped closer, his shadow looming over her. He didn't even look at the screaming red alerts on the screen. He saw only an opportunity to exert power over someone he deemed a subhuman. What you're doing is a federal breach. You think because you wipe the dust off the consoles, you understand what's inside them? You're a delusional girl with a savior complex. He reached over and slammed his own override key, locking the terminal. Rachel felt a physical pang as the connection severed. The bypass was still running, the attack was gaining ground, and Thomas had just blinded the only person who could see it. "You're done," Thomas said, his face inches from hers, a cruel smile touching his lips. "Security is already on their way. You'll hand in your keys, pack your pathetic box, and you'll never set foot in a Tier 4 facility again. I don't care if the city burns, as long as people like you aren't the ones holding the matches." The walk to the security checkpoint felt longer than the 3 miles of fiber-optic cable Rachel had laid by hand 5 years ago. 2 guards flanked her, their boots rhythmic and heavy, a stark contrast to the silence of her own retreat. Behind them, Thomas K. trailed at a distance, his arms crossed, watching her with the satisfied gaze of a man who had finally scrubbed a persistent smudge from his window. At the main desk, the air was thick with the scent of ozone and judgment. The day shift was starting to trickle in, bright-eyed junior analysts in crisp button-downs who paused to whisper as they saw the ghost of the night shift being escorted out like a criminal. "The keys, Nguyen," Thomas said, his voice echoing in the marble lobby. "All of them." Rachel reached into the pocket of her oversized hoodie. Her fingers brushed against the cold, jagged metal of the Tier 4 master set, keys that shouldn't even exist, keys she had forged herself to keep the city alive. One by one, she laid them on the laminate counter. Each clack sounded like a gavel. Next came the badge. She unclipped the plastic rectangle, the photo showing a younger, less tired version of herself. Thomas snatched it before she could even set it down. With a theatrical flourish, he slid it through the heavy-duty industrial shredder mounted behind the desk. The sound of plastic being ground into confetti was the only goodbye she got. "And the personal effects," the guard muttered, sliding a battered cardboard box toward her. Rachel began to pack. It was a pathetic inventory, a half-empty bottle of water, a pair of glasses with a cracked frame, a notebook filled with cleaning schedules that were actually complex algorithmic shortcuts, and her stethoscope. "A stethoscope?" Thomas laughed, picking it up by the tubing as if it were a dead snake. "What, do you play doctor in the broom closet? Or are you listening for the heart of the machine?" He tossed it carelessly into the box, the metal chest piece clanging against the cardboard. "Get her out of here. If she's seen within 50 yards of the perimeter, arrest her for domestic espionage." The heavy pneumatic doors hissed open, and the humidity of the coming storm hit Rachel like a physical blow. The guard stepped back, the glass doors sealing shut behind her with a definitive, pressurized thud. She was out. The sky was the color of a bruised lung. As Rachel stepped onto the sidewalk, the first heavy drops of rain began to fall, hot and stinging. Within seconds, the cardboard box was damp, the bottom softening under the weight of her meager life. She clutched it to her chest, her sneakers soaking through as she waded toward the bus stop. She looked back once. The brain loomed behind her, a fortress of light and power. From this distance, she could see the faint, rhythmic pulse of the external cooling towers. They were spinning too fast. The vibration was wrong. The tremor she had seen on the monitor was growing, a digital seizure that would soon paralyze every elevator, every hospital ventilator, and every traffic light in a 3-state radius. Thomas K. had his silence. He had his clean floors. And in roughly 30 minutes, he would have a catastrophe he was utterly unqualified to handle. Rachel turned her back on the building and started to walk. The rain turned into a deluge, blurring the world until the headlights of the morning commute looked like drowning stars. She was nobody now. Just a wet girl with a box, disappearing into the gray, while the masterpiece she had built began to scream in a language only she could translate. The thunder wasn't coming from the clouds anymore. It was the rhythmic, metallic scream of tires tortured against wet pavement. Rachel didn't look up at first, she was too busy trying to keep the bottom of her waterlogged box from giving way. But when the first black sedan swerved onto the shoulder, kicking up a wall of muddy water that drenched her jeans, she stopped. Then came the second. And the third. The convoy didn't just stop, it hunted. The vehicles angled themselves into a jagged blockade, their high-intensity LEDs slicing through the gloom with an aggressive, rhythmic strobe. For a terrifying heartbeat, Rachel thought Thomas K. had sent them to finish the job, to make sure that the janitor truly vanished. She clutched the box tighter, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The rear door of the flagship Mercedes swung open before the car had fully settled. Director Strauss lunged out, his expensive wool coat instantly turning a heavy, dark charcoal in the downpour. He looked frantic, his eyes scanning the sidewalk with the desperation of a man looking for a life raft in the middle of the ocean. When his eyes locked onto hers, the relief that washed over his face was almost jarring. "Rachel," he shouted, stumbling over the curb. He ignored the Secret Service agents who tried to shield him with umbrellas. He reached her in 4 long strides, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Thank God. We went to your apartment, the neighbors said you were still on shift, but the facility logs said you'd been purged." Rachel wiped a mixture of rain and cold sweat from her forehead. "I was fired, Director. Security risk. I'm just a janitor, remember?" Strauss grabbed her by the shoulders, his fingers digging into the damp fabric of her hoodie. "Forget night. That arrogant idiot has doomed us." 10 minutes after he locked your terminal, the southern hub went dark. Now the eastern seaboard is desensing. It's not just an attack, Rachel. It's a phantom. It's eating through the mainframes, and every patch we throw at it just makes it stronger. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a frantic whisper that cut through the roar of the rain. "It's the ghost code, isn't it? The failsafe you built into the core 5 years ago. It's triggered, and the system won't accept any commands because it doesn't recognize the signatures of the current staff. It's looking for the architect." Rachel looked down at her box. At the stethoscope and the notebook of cleaning schedules. The irony tasted like copper in her mouth. "I told him it was failing. He told me to find a floor that needed mopping." "The city is dying, Rachel," Strauss pleaded, his eyes bloodshot. "The hospitals are on backup generators that are already redlining. The subway lines are trapped in the tunnels. In 20 minutes, the regional water pressure will hit the surge point and the pipes will start bursting from here to Montauk. You're the only one who can speak to the machine. You're the only one it trusts." He gestured to the open door of the sedan, the warm, leather-scented interior a sharp contrast to the cold misery of the highway. "Please. Hand me the box. We have a police escort cleared all the way to the brain. I'll personally break down the doors if I have to." Rachel looked at the convoy, then back at the dark, flickering skyline of the city she had spent a lifetime protecting from the shadows. The invisibility was gone. The hoodie wouldn't hide her anymore. She stepped toward the car, handing the soggy cardboard box to the most powerful man in the state. "I don't just want the doors open, Strauss," she said, her voice turning as cold and precise as the code she was about to write. "I want Thomas K. to watch me do it." The sirens didn't scream, they wailed, a low, guttural pulse that cleared the rain-slicked roads as the convoy tore back toward the facility. Inside the lead Mercedes, Rachel sat in silence, her wet hoodie steaming slightly against the heated leather. She didn't look like a savior. She looked like a drowned stray, but her eyes were fixed on the digital clock on the dashboard. 14 minutes. The convoy didn't slow for the perimeter gates. The heavy steel barriers recognized the director's transponder and retracted with violent speed. They roared up to the main entrance, tires shrieking as they skipped the curb to park directly under the glass canopy. Strauss was out of the car before it fully stopped, but he didn't lead. He stepped aside, holding the door open for the woman in the gray hoodie. When the pneumatic doors hissed open, the lobby was a theater of chaos. Alarms were chiming in dissonant intervals, and the junior analysts were running between desks with white-knuckled grips on their tablets. At the center of the storm stood Thomas K., his tie loosened, screaming into a headset. "I don't care if the authentication is failing. Bypass the kernel." Thomas roared. He turned as the heavy tread of the director's security detail thundered into the room. "Director Strauss. Thank God. We're managing the situation, but the system is." He stopped mid-sentence. His jaw didn't just drop, it seemed to unhinge as he saw Rachel walking a half-step ahead of the director. She was still clutching her soggy cardboard box, a stray strand of wet hair plastered across her forehead. "What is she doing here?" Thomas hissed, his face flushing a deep, mottled purple. "I had this trespasser removed. Security, detain her immediately." The guards didn't move. They stood like statues behind Strauss. "Sit down, Thomas," Strauss said, his voice vibrating with a lethal quietness. "Sir, you don't understand, she's a janitor. She's probably the one who uploaded the virus." Rachel didn't even look at him. She didn't have time for the politics of small men. She walked straight to the primary command dais, the throne, and set her wet cardboard box directly on top of the $1 million console. Water from the box dripped onto the haptic interface, but she didn't care. She reached in, pulled out her stethoscope, and draped it around her neck like a silver garland of war. The room went deathly silent. The analysts stopped running. The air seemed to crystallize as Rachel placed her hand on the biometric scanner. "Authorization, architect. Protocol, Midnight Sun," she said, her voice cutting through the alarms. The console didn't just unlock, it turned gold. The red warnings that had been choking the screens for the last hour vanished, replaced by a complex, shimmering lattice of white light. A low, melodic hum vibrated through the floorboards, the sound of the brain finally recognizing its master. "The grid isn't failing," Rachel said, her fingers blurring across the keys, finally speaking in her true mother tongue. "It's protecting itself from you." She glanced over her shoulder at Thomas, who was trembling, his eyes darting between the director and the janitor, who was currently commanding the most sophisticated network on the continent. "I believe you mentioned something about a floor that needed mopping, Thomas," Rachel said, the glow of the monitors reflecting in her eyes. "Start with the lobby. I've tracked mud everywhere." The golden lattice of the Midnight Sun protocol pulsed under Rachel's fingertips, but as she dove deeper into the kernel, the elegance of the code began to fray. She wasn't seeing the chaotic, scorched earth tactics of an outside hacker. This wasn't a wildfire, it was a series of surgical extractions. Her eyes narrowed, tracking a ghost thread of data as it bypassed the primary firewalls she had built years ago. The system wasn't being broken into, it was being let out. "Strauss, look at the port logs," Rachel murmured, her voice tight. The director leaned over her shoulder, squinting at the rapid-fire lines of hexadecimal. "I don't see anything but the crash reports." "That's because you're looking at the symptoms," Rachel said, her fingers dancing a frantic rhythm. "Look at the credentials used to lower the bridge. The attack didn't pick the lock. Someone handed it the master key at 2:14 a.m. Right when I was told to stay in the utility corridors." She pulled up a hidden sub-layer of the security audit. On the screen, a digital signature appeared, glowing an accusatory amber. It was a high-level override, one designed to test the system's resilience, a backdoor that should have been sealed the moment the test ended. Instead, it had been left wide open like a knife held to the city's throat. Rachel turned her head slowly to where Thomas K. stood. He was backed against a server rack, the cool blue light of the room casting long, skeletal shadows across his face. He wasn't looking at the screens anymore, he was looking at the exit. The 0-day wasn't an accident, was it, Thomas? Rachel asked. The room went cold. The frantic tapping of other analysts ceased as her voice echoed through the war room. You didn't fire me because I was a security risk. You fired me because I was the only one who would notice you'd sold the bypass codes to a third party. You needed the janitor gone so you could play the hero who almost saved the city. That's a lie, Thomas stammered, his voice thin and reedy. That's a fabrication by a disgruntled ex-employee who... The signature is yours, Thomas, Rachel interrupted, her voice gaining a sharp, crystalline edge. You used your private encryption to mask the handshake with a mercenary server in Eastern Europe. You didn't realize that my ghost code logs everything, including the invisible. You invited them in. You gave them the knife, and you told them exactly where to twist it. She turned back to the console, her face illuminated by the rising tide of data. But you made one mistake. You forgot that I didn't just build the walls. I built the foundation. And I'm about to collapse the ceiling on your guests. The monitors shifted from gold to a deep, predatory violet. Rachel wasn't just patching the system anymore, she was hunting. She could feel the intruders through the haptic interface, their digital fingers scrambling to hold onto the stolen data as she began to rewrite the logic gates in real time. Beside her, Strauss's face hardened into stone. He didn't need to be a coder to recognize the look of a trapped rat. He didn't look at Rachel, he looked at his head of security. Thomas, the director said softly, if I were you, I'd stop worrying about the grid and start worrying about the treason charges. But as Rachel prepared to sever the connection, the lights in the room flickered and died. A heavy, mechanical clunk echoed from the levels below. They're not just in the wires, Rachel whispered, her heart skipping a beat. They're in the building. The darkness in the war room was absolute for only a heartbeat before the crimson emergency lights kicked in, bathing the glass and steel in the color of a warning. The hum of the servers shifted from a steady thrum to a panicked, high-pitched whine. Below them, in the bowels of the facility, the heavy iron thud of breaching charges vibrated through the floorboards. They're hitting the coolant manifolds, Rachel said, her voice eerily calm despite the chaos. She didn't look up from the terminal. The violet glow of her screen was the only steady light in the room. They know they can't beat the code, so they're going to melt the hardware. Security. To the sub-level maintenance bay. Strauss roared into his comms, but the only response was the crackle of static and the distant, rapid-fire chatter of suppressed submachine guns echoing up the elevator shafts. The mercenaries weren't just hackers, they were a cleanup crew. If the servers melted, the digital evidence of Thomas K's betrayal would vanish into a puddle of molten silicon and charred plastic. Rachel, we have to move, Strauss urged, reaching for her arm. If the cooling lines are severed, this room becomes an oven in 3 minutes. We need to get you to the surface. I leave, and the city stays dark, Rachel countered, her fingers moving in a blur, weaving a digital cage around the stolen data packets. I have to finish the encapsulation. If I lose the link now, the virus becomes a permanent part of the grid's DNA. It'll be a lobotomy for the entire eastern seaboard. The heavy reinforced doors at the end of the hall buckled inward with a deafening groan of tortured metal. Strauss's personal security detail scrambled, overturning heavy oak desks to create a makeshift firing line. The air grew thick with the smell of cordite and the sharp, metallic tang of ozone. Clang! A bullet ricocheted off a server rack 3 feet from Rachel's head, sparking a shower of white-hot embers. She didn't flinch. She couldn't afford to. She felt the temperature in the room rising, 75 degrees, 80, 85. Sweat began to bead on her forehead, stinging her eyes, but she kept her gaze locked on the scrolling lines of logic. Behind her, the war room turned into a kill zone. The rhythmic pop-pop-pop of the guards' sidearms traded blows with the heavy, rhythmic thumping of the attackers' rifles. Glass shattered, raining down like diamonds in the red light. The primary pump just went offline, Rachel whispered, more to the machine than to Strauss. They've cut the freon lines. The servers began to scream, a literal, mechanical howling as the fans spun at desperate speeds to compensate for the rising heat. The air shimmered with thermal distortion. Rachel's skin felt tight, her lungs burning with every breath of the baking air. She could hear the mercenaries grunting as they pushed against the door, the sheer force of their numbers grinding against the guards' desperate defense. 10 more seconds, Rachel gasped, her vision blurring as the heat hit 95 degrees. Just 10 more seconds. A mercenary in tactical black armor kicked through the shattered remains of the door, his rifle leveled at the central dais. Strauss stepped in front of her, drawing his own weapon, but Rachel didn't even blink. She slammed her palm against the "execute" command just as a bullet whistled past her ear, shattering the monitor next to her. The screen didn't go dark. It turned a blinding, pure white. "Got you," she hissed. The heat in the room was a physical weight now, thick with the smell of scorched insulation and the metallic tang of blood. The server fans were failing, their bearings screaming in a death rattle as the temperature climbed toward the hardware's breaking point. Rachel's vision swam, the red emergency lights bleeding into the violet glow of her terminal. She felt the sweat soaking through her hoodie, but her hands, the hands of a janitor, the hands of an architect, remained steady. On her screen, a progress bar crawled forward with agonizing slowness, 94%. 95%. Behind her, the defensive line was collapsing. Strauss fired his last round as a flashbang detonated near the entrance, white light momentarily drowning the crimson gloom. The mercenaries were through the threshold, boots crunching on shattered glass, their silhouettes jagged and predatory. They didn't want the data anymore, they wanted the silence that only a bullet could provide. 98%. "Rachel, now!" Strauss yelled, his voice sounding miles away through the ringing in her ears. She didn't hit enter. She didn't have time for the keystroke. She performed a hardline bridge, ripping the stethoscope from her neck and jamming the modified jack into the primary bus. She wasn't just sending a file, she was injecting a digital vaccine directly into the city's jugular. 100%. For a heartbeat, the world stopped. The screaming fans fell silent. The gunfire ceased as every electronic device in the room, and the city beyond, reset in a unified, deafening click. Then, the light came back. It didn't just flicker on, it surged. Across the three-state area, miles of darkened highway suddenly exploded into a river of white and red. The skyline of the city, which had been a jagged tomb of shadow, ignited floor by floor, a vertical sunrise that pushed back the storm. In the hospitals, ventilators sighed back to life. In the subways, the trapped trains hummed with renewed purpose. In the war room, the effect was devastating for the attackers. Rachel hadn't just patched the grid, she had turned the network into a trap. The mercenaries' tactical headsets erupted with a high-decibel burst of feedback, sending them to their knees, clutching their ears. Their encrypted tablets, once windows into the city's vulnerabilities, now displayed a single, scrolling line of text, property of the architect. Trace active. The digital attackers were pinned. By the time they tried to sever their remote connections, Rachel's ghost code had already backtraced their signatures, locking their local servers and routing their physical locations directly to every federal agency on the coast. They hadn't just lost the fight, they had been archived. Rachel slumped back into her chair, the plastic melting slightly against her spine. The cooling systems kicked back in with a thunderous roar, a blast of chilled air finally cutting through the oppressive heat. She watched the monitors as the violet lattice turned a steady, peaceful blue. The city was breathing again. Strauss stood over the downed mercenary at his feet, his chest heaving. He looked at the girl in the soaked gray hoodie, then at the screens showing a million lights flickering back to life across the coast. The janitor had finished her shift. But as Rachel looked at her trembling hands, she knew the shadows wouldn't hold her anymore. The architect had been found, and she had just turned the lights on for the entire world to see. The silence that followed the restoration of the grid was more profound than the chaos that preceded it. The only sound in the war room was the rhythmic, cooling tick of hardware and the heavy, metallic rasp of zip ties being tightened. Federal agents, arriving like a secondary tide behind the light, moved through the room with surgical efficiency. Thomas K. stood near the shattered glass of the observation deck, his tailored suit jacket torn and his face a mask of ashen disbelief. He didn't look like a titan of industry anymore, he looked like a small, hollow man caught in a glare he couldn't survive. Two agents stepped forward, pulling his arms behind his back. The clink of the handcuffs was the final punctuation mark on his career. As he was led past the central dais, he stopped, his eyes landing on Rachel. For a moment, the old arrogance flared in his gaze, the desperate need to look down on the woman who had dismantled him. "You're still just a ghost, Nguyen," he spat, his voice trembling. "They'll use you until the crisis is over, and then they'll put you back in the basement where you belong." Rachel didn't look up from the diagnostic scrolling across her palm top. "The difference, Thomas, is that I built the basement. I know exactly how to get out. You're the one going somewhere with no exit." She watched as he was marched into the elevator, the doors closing on his legacy forever. Director Strauss approached the console, stepping over the debris of the siege. He looked at the room, the shattered glass, the smoking server racks, and the girl in the oversized, water-stained hoodie who had saved it all with a stethoscope and a line of ghost code. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a new badge. It wasn't the standard plastic rectangle she had surrendered earlier. It was a heavy, gold-trimmed credential, the highest level of clearance the facility offered. He laid it on the console next to her cardboard box. "We're going to need a formal statement for the board," Strauss said, his voice weary but filled with a new, profound respect. "And we're going to need someone to oversee the complete reconstruction of the security protocols. Not as a consultant. Not as a ghost." He gestured to the empty glass office that overlooked the server floor, the office Thomas K. had once occupied. "The director's chair is empty, Rachel. It's been waiting for the person who actually understands the heart of this city. It's yours, if you want it." Rachel looked at the badge, then at the sprawling city skyline visible through the reinforced windows. The lights were steady now, a sea of diamonds stretching to the horizon. She thought about the years of invisibility, the quiet humming of the servers at 3 a.m., and the safety she had found in the shadows. But the shadows had nearly let the world burn. She stood up, her joints aching from the tension of the last hour. She reached up and grabbed the hem of her damp, heavy gray hoodie. With a single, decisive motion, she pulled it over her head and tossed it into the nearby trash bin, the same bin she had emptied 1,000 times as a janitor. Underneath, she wore a simple, dark t-shirt, her shoulders square and her gaze fixed. She looked at the cardboard box, picking out only her stethoscope and her notebook. The rest. The old life, the hiding, the silence, she left on the table. "I don't want the office," Rachel said, picking up the new badge and clipping it to her shirt. "I want the server floor. And I want a budget for a new team of janitors. We have a lot of cleaning up to do." She walked toward the glass office, not to hide, but to lead. As she passed the windows, the sun began to break through the retreating storm clouds, catching the gold on her badge and turning the architect into a silhouette of light.